Jasmine Mitchell stood tall in the courtroom, her calm demeanor belying the tense atmosphere. She had grown accustomed to being the center of attention, whether in meetings with government officials or speaking at public forums about policy changes. Today, however, was different. Today, she was not addressing a room of influential leaders or passionate supporters. Today, she was before Judge Thomas Ellison, whose stern gaze scrutinized her every move. The courtroom, typically a place of dry legal proceedings, felt strangely charged as Jasmine awaited the judge's decision. She had come here to clear up what she believed to be a minor misunderstanding, an administrative error related to her advocacy work. Jasmine had been collaborating with several local government offices, pushing for more inclusive hiring practices and improved conditions for minority workers in public service. Her organization had been instrumental in helping streamline operations within government sectors, but it also involved a lot of paperwork, permits, and licenses, some of which, Jasmine acknowledged, had been slightly delayed. However, the fine she faced today was not about an oversight in paperwork. The charges were linked to a business filing that had been, in Judge Ellison's view, improperly completed. To anyone unfamiliar with the intricacies of Jasmine's work, it seemed like a small matter, nothing more than a technicality in the complex world of local regulations. But to Jasmine, this felt like an obstacle she could easily overcome. After all, she had seen much bigger challenges in her career. As Judge Ellison prepared to announce his decision, the courtroom fell into a silence that seemed to stretch on forever. The judge's gavel echoed as he spoke, his voice cutting through the stillness. "The court finds you in violation of local business regulations. Ms. Mitchell, you will be fined $1,000 for the discrepancy in your filings," Judge Ellison declared, his tone firm. He didn't look up as he spoke, his attention already shifting to the next case. Jasmine's heart raced for a moment, but only because she had anticipated this response. She had expected a fine, though perhaps not one this large. Still, she kept her composure, nodding respectfully as the courtroom filled with a few murmurs from the crowd. She didn't need to argue, didn't need to protest. She would handle this in the same way she handled every other setback, with grace and determination. As Jasmine left the courtroom, the weight of the fine seemed almost secondary to the idea that her work had only just begun. She had faced much greater obstacles in her mission to reform the local government workforce, and this small setback was nothing more than a blip on her radar. Little did she know, the fine would become the spark for something far bigger, a revolution that would not only change the course of her life, but also the future of public service itself. Outside the courthouse, she paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. The fight was far from over. As news of Jasmine Mitchell's fine began to circulate, many in the city saw it as just another routine legal matter. The headlines in the local paper were brief, outlining the fine and noting the nature of the infraction. But for those who took a deeper interest in local affairs, the story didn't add up. Jasmine was a well-known figure in the city, a black woman who had spent years building a reputation not just as an entrepreneur, but as a fierce advocate for reform in government workspaces. To some, the fine seemed oddly trivial for someone who had dedicated so much to improving the system. It didn't take long for the curiosity to snowball. Jasmine had always operated under the radar in terms of media attention. Her public presence had been purposeful, focusing on initiatives that quietly disrupted the status quo. She wasn't interested in becoming a celebrity. Her work was her calling. Her organization, Next Step Initiative, had been instrumental in bringing innovation to local government sectors. Over the last few years, Jasmine had become a trusted ally to key players in public service. Her efforts weren't just about advocacy. They were about systemic change, designed to create a government workforce that better reflected the people it served. The policies she promoted were reshaping the way the public sector worked from the inside out. While most people knew her as a businesswoman and community leader, fewer understood the depth of Jasmine's influence. Her work wasn't limited to a single issue. It was a comprehensive approach to transforming government. Jasmine had spent years working closely with human resources departments, conducting workshops for underrepresented groups, and launching mentorship programs for aspiring public servants from diverse backgrounds. She'd helped reimagine job descriptions to ensure they attracted a broader pool of applicants and worked to eliminate bias in hiring processes. Her efforts weren't just theoretical, they were backed by tangible results. In the departments where her programs had been implemented, turnover rates had dropped, productivity had increased, and most importantly, employees felt heard and valued. As public attention shifted from the fine to Jasmine's true influence, the conversation began to change. Local reporters dug deeper, interviewing colleagues, employees who had participated in Jasmine's programs, and even elected officials who had worked alongside her. The more people learned about Jasmine's impact, the more they began to see the fine not as an isolated incident, but as a symptom of a larger issue. The people closest to Jasmine knew her well. They knew she didn't back down easily, that she had a quiet resilience that allowed her to take on challenges far greater than anything the legal system could throw at her. But this time, things felt different. Jasmine wasn't just defending herself against a fine. She was standing at the edge of something bigger, something that could change the entire landscape of how government served its people. While the fine may have been an inconvenience, Jasmine's true mission had only just begun to draw the kind of attention it deserved. What seemed like a small setback was now fueling a much larger conversation, a conversation that was about to go beyond the courtroom and into the heart of the public sector. The day after the fine was announced, Jasmine Mitchell sat at her desk in the heart of her small office. Papers were scattered around her, each representing a new initiative or project in the works. To the untrained eye, her office might have seemed like just another place of business, but there was a palpable energy in the room. It was the kind of energy that came from someone deeply committed to change, not the fleeting kind of change that made headlines for a week and then faded into obscurity, but the kind that created lasting transformation. While the fine had momentarily disrupted her routine, Jasmine had a bigger mission that demanded her focus. She wasn't just running a business. She was spearheading a movement that was slowly, but surely, redefining how government agencies operated. Her efforts had already started to shift the landscape of local government employment, and now, more than ever, she felt a responsibility to ensure that this revolution reached the highest levels of influence. For years, Jasmine had been quietly building a network of allies within the public sector, HR specialists, department heads, and even elected officials, who shared her vision for a more inclusive and dynamic workforce. They weren't just talking about diversity in the traditional sense. Jasmine's mission was broader. She was tackling the deeply embedded structural issues that often prevented marginalized communities from accessing meaningful work in the public sector. Her programs were designed to ensure that employees weren't just hired, they were supported, nurtured, and given the tools to succeed in ways that had been overlooked for generations. Her work had started with small but effective pilot programs. In one department, Jasmine had helped implement a mentorship program aimed at fostering leadership skills among minority employees. The results were extraordinary. Turnover rates dropped significantly, and those who participated in the program reported higher job satisfaction and a sense of belonging. In another case, Jasmine helped streamline hiring practices, pushing for a more transparent and inclusive approach. The outcome was a significant increase in applications from women and people of color, many of whom had previously felt excluded from government roles. But it wasn't just about changing the numbers. It was about changing the culture. Jasmine's vision was that every government department, no matter how big or small, would reflect the diverse population it served. She wanted to see employees who felt seen, heard, and valued, not just as workers, but as people. She wanted to see a shift in how public service was viewed, not as a static job, but as a dynamic career path that could grow, adapt, and evolve with the times. Despite the success of her efforts, Jasmine knew there was much more work to be done. The fine was just a bump in the road, but it had sparked something in the public. Her story was being shared, her initiatives were gaining attention, and a growing number of people were beginning to ask, "Who is this woman? And why is she so committed to transforming the workforce?" Jasmine knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance. There would be setbacks. But with every conversation, every policy shift, every success story, she was quietly building the foundation for a revolution in the workforce, a revolution that would ultimately reshape the very nature of public service. Judge Thomas Ellison sat at his desk late into the evening, papers scattered in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere. The day's case had lingered in his thoughts longer than he'd expected. He had been in the judiciary long enough to know the weight of his decisions, but something about Jasmine Mitchell's case didn't sit right. She was a business owner, a community figure, and from what he was now learning, someone whose influence stretched far beyond the courtroom. It wasn't just the fine itself that troubled him. It was the growing recognition that this was no ordinary case. In the following days, he had been approached by colleagues, acquaintances, even members of his own family, all asking the same question: did you know who she really is? At first, Judge Ellison had brushed off their concerns. Jasmine had been fined for a technicality, nothing more. He had a job to do, and that meant enforcing the law without personal bias. But as he sifted through more news articles, interviews, and online discussions, he found himself confronted with something that didn't align with his initial assessment. Jasmine wasn't just another local business owner. She was a disruptor, a leader of a movement that sought to change how government agencies treated their employees, particularly those from marginalized groups. He couldn't ignore the growing tide of conversation. The same people who had once praised him for his no-nonsense approach to the law now seemed to question his judgment. Was it possible that he had been too quick to judge? Had he dismissed her efforts without fully understanding their impact? The more Ellison dug into Jasmine's work, the more he began to appreciate the magnitude of her influence. She wasn't just an advocate for diversity. She was a strategic force for real change within the government workforce. Jasmine's programs had already proven successful in several local departments, improving job retention rates and fostering a more inclusive culture in places that had historically struggled with discrimination and bias. He had overlooked all of this when he handed down the fine, focusing only on a minor administrative error without considering the larger context. In one of his quieter moments, Ellison found himself reflecting on his own experiences within the judiciary. He had spent years presiding over cases where biases, both subtle and overt, had played a role in shaping outcomes. He had been trained to uphold the law impartially, but was it possible that he had allowed his own biases, perhaps unknowingly, to influence his judgment of Jasmine? The unease inside him grew. What if his decision had done more harm than good? What if, in trying to enforce the law, he had unwittingly stood in the way of something greater? His discomfort was palpable. This wasn't just about a fine anymore. It was about something far deeper. Chance to rethink how he viewed reformers like Jasmine and the systems they were trying to change. By the time his gavel fell at the end of the day, Judge Ellison wasn't sure of much, but one thing was clear. He needed to reconsider his position. As Judge Ellison continued to wrestle with his growing doubts, the conversation around Jasmine Mitchell only gained momentum. Her name became synonymous with reform and innovation, and the stories of her impact spread like wildfire. What had initially appeared to be a minor legal issue had quickly evolved into a larger conversation about the future of public service. Jasmine's work, once relegated to behind-the-scenes efforts, was now being discussed in the open, and the more people learned about her initiatives, the clearer it became that her influence was far more profound than anyone had realized, especially Judge Ellison. In the days following the fine, articles began to surface that highlighted the far-reaching effects of Jasmine's work. It wasn't just her business acumen that was garnering attention. It was the way she had transformed the local government workforce, one department at a time. Her programs had quietly made waves in government offices across the city, and what had once been dismissed as small-scale initiatives were now seen as revolutionary. Jasmine had started with a simple goal: to create a more inclusive, efficient, and equitable public service system. She had worked with HR departments to overhaul hiring processes, ensuring they were more transparent and accessible to a diverse pool of applicants. She had initiated mentorship programs that paired experienced public servants with those from underrepresented backgrounds, providing them with the guidance and support needed to thrive. In one department, a pilot program designed by Jasmine had led to a significant drop in employee turnover, while satisfaction levels among staff soared. These weren't just numbers. They were real stories of lives changed, of people who had previously felt overlooked and undervalued, now finding opportunities to succeed and grow. The most striking part of Jasmine's work, however, was the way she had challenged the existing mindset within government agencies. She wasn't just advocating for diversity's sake. She was advocating for a new kind of government workforce, one that was more adaptable, innovative, and reflective of the communities it served. Her programs weren't just improving conditions for individuals, they were transforming the way government operated as a whole. By emphasizing inclusion, transparency, and mentorship, Jasmine had created an environment where employees felt empowered to voice their concerns, propose new ideas, and take ownership of their work. These shifts were measurable. Absenteeism rates dropped, productivity increased, and for the first time in years, employees felt that their contributions mattered. Judge Ellison, who had once viewed Jasmine's case as nothing more than an administrative matter, now began to see the complexity of her work. His initial view of Jasmine as just another local entrepreneur seemed woefully narrow in light of what he was learning. He found himself becoming not only more fascinated by her efforts, but also deeply impressed by the depth of her influence. But there was more. As he learned about the breadth of her initiatives, he realized that Jasmine wasn't just affecting the lives of government workers. She was reshaping the very fabric of public service itself. Her quiet revolution was proving that real change didn't have to be loud to be effective. It could begin with small steps, and over time, grow into something transformative. For the first time, Judge Ellison felt the weight of his decision settling in. Had he truly understood the magnitude of the person he had found? He wasn't so sure anymore. The tension in Judge Ellison's mind reached a tipping point. His unease had morphed into a genuine sense of responsibility. The fine he had imposed on Jasmine Mitchell, which he had once seen as a simple legal matter, now seemed to represent something much more significant. It wasn't just about one woman's infraction. It was about a larger movement that he had inadvertently stood in the way of. He knew that if he didn't address the growing doubts, they would continue to gnaw at him, undermining his confidence in his role as a judge. And so, one afternoon, Ellison picked up the phone and made the call that would change everything. Jasmine answered on the third ring. Her voice was calm, professional, but there was a trace of curiosity in it, a subtle recognition that something had shifted in the air. "Hello, Ms. Mitchell. This is Judge Ellison," he began, his voice steadier than he felt. "I've been reflecting on your case, and after learning more about the work you're doing, I think it's time we have a conversation." Jasmine was quiet for a moment, no doubt surprised by the call. She had been focused on her mission for so long that the notion of a judge reaching out to her felt almost surreal. But she didn't hesitate. "I'd be happy to meet, Judge. What's on your mind?" Within days, they sat across from one another in a quiet cafe, the noise of the world outside buzzing in the background, but the conversation between them felt intense and focused. Jasmine, ever the professional, maintained her composure, while Ellison seemed almost disarmed by her presence. She wasn't the person he had imagined. Her calm demeanor was filled with purpose, and her eyes held a depth of understanding that belied the challenges she had faced. "Ms. Mitchell," Ellison began, "I've spent the past week learning more about your work, and I must admit I was wrong. I didn't fully understand the scope of what you're doing." Jasmine nodded, though she wasn't surprised. She had long been aware that people often underestimated her, especially those in positions of power. "I'm glad to hear you're taking a closer look. What I'm trying to do isn't about me. It's about changing how the government operates. It's about creating spaces where people are treated fairly, where opportunities aren't limited by background or circumstance." Ellison shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm realizing now that I've been blind to what you're accomplishing, My decision to fine you was based on a narrow view of the law, but it didn't take into account the broader context of your work. I see now that I may have done more harm than good." Jasmine's eyes softened, though her tone remained firm. "Judge, I'm not here to make you feel guilty. My goal has always been to make the system better, not to place blame. But I do think it's important for people in positions of power, like you, to understand that sometimes we're all part of a system that doesn't always serve everyone equally. And that's why the work I do, small as it might seem, matters." Ellison leaned back, a thoughtful silence filling the space between them. Jasmine's words hit harder than he had expected. He hadn't come into the conversation intending to admit anything, but her honesty and commitment were undeniable. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't simply focused on enforcing the law. He was thinking about how the law itself could evolve. "I'd like to support you," Ellison said, his voice quieter now. "I think I've misunderstood your mission. I want to be part of this change." Jasmine's expression remained steady, but inside, she felt a shift. This wasn't just a conversation. It was the beginning of something much bigger, for both of them. In the days following their conversation, Judge Ellison found himself grappling with a profound shift in perspective. He had never been one to second-guess his judgments, but Jasmine's words had struck a chord deep within him. As he thought about the case, about his own role in upholding the law, he began to see the broader implications of his decision. What he had once viewed as an isolated fine was now emblematic of something far larger, a system that had often been slow to embrace the kind of reform Jasmine was advocating for. Judge Ellison spent hours reflecting on his own position in the courtroom, thinking back to the many cases he had presided over where his rulings were influenced, at times, by ingrained biases, unintentional, perhaps, but biases nonetheless. He had spent his career striving for fairness, yet the truth was that fairness could be a deeply subjective notion, shaped by his own experiences, upbringing, and worldview. As a white man in a position of authority, he had never fully understood the daily struggles of the communities Jasmine sought to uplift. He had never been the target of systemic barriers, nor had he experienced firsthand the kind of exclusion Jasmine's programs worked to address. The unease he had felt over the past week now coalesced into clarity. Jasmine's fine, which he had initially thought of as an ordinary legal matter, was far from ordinary. It was a reminder that, as a judge, his responsibility wasn't just to the letter of the law. It was to the people it affected, to the communities that depended on fair and just governance. Jasmine's vision for a more inclusive, compassionate public sector was not just a noble cause. It was essential to creating a future where people of all backgrounds could thrive in the workforce. The more he thought about it, the more Ellison realized that he could no longer be a passive observer in this conversation about reform. He could not simply impose fines and move on. He had to ask himself, how could he, as a member of the judiciary, help support the kind of change Jasmine was trying to bring about? How could his own position of authority be used to facilitate growth and progress rather than hinder it? That afternoon, Judge Ellison made a decision that surprised even him. He called Jasmine again, this time with a different tone. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, his voice steady but earnest, "I've thought about our conversation at length, and I need to do more than just retract the fine. I want to publicly acknowledge the importance of your work. What you're doing is critical to the future of our workforce, and it's something I should have recognized sooner." Jasmine listened quietly, sensing the sincerity in his voice. "Thank you, Judge," she replied, her words calm but carrying the weight of someone who had spent years pushing for change. "But this isn't just about me. It's about a collective effort. It's about working together to dismantle systems that have held people back for too long." Ellison nodded. He understood now. The revolution was bigger than one person, but with his public support, Jasmine's mission had just found an ally in a place where it mattered most. The road ahead would be long, but at least now, they were walking it together. The weeks that followed were a turning point, not just for Jasmine Mitchell and Judge Ellison, but for the entire city. What had started as an isolated legal case had evolved into a broader conversation about systemic reform in government. And now, that conversation was gaining real momentum. Jasmine's quiet revolution in the workforce was beginning to take on a life of its own, thanks in no small part to Ellison's unexpected shift in perspective. The first sign that things were changing came when Judge Ellison publicly acknowledged his previous misstep. In a statement to the press, he announced that he was not only overturning the fine, but also offering his full support to Jasmine's efforts in reforming government workplaces. His words were carefully chosen but sincere. After further reflection, I've come to understand the importance of the work Ms. Mitchell is doing. Her efforts to create a more inclusive, transparent, and equitable workforce are not only necessary but vital to the future of public service. I am proud to lend my support to her mission and to encourage others in positions of authority to do the same. The announcement was met with surprise, but also with a wave of support. Many saw Ellison's reversal as a sign of personal growth and a recognition that the system needed to be more adaptable, more responsive to the needs of the people it was meant to serve. It was also a significant step in the fight for greater inclusivity in government workspaces, a fight Jasmine had been leading for years. For the first time, she wasn't just pushing against the system, she was finding support within it. With Ellison's backing, Jasmine was able to expand her efforts, moving beyond her initial pilot programs and into larger initiatives that affected entire departments. Government agencies, once hesitant to embrace change, were now reaching out to her, asking for guidance on how to implement more inclusive policies. Jasmine worked tirelessly, partnering with HR specialists, training leaders, and launching mentorship programs for underrepresented groups. She brought in experts to help rewrite job descriptions to ensure they were more accessible to people from diverse backgrounds. And then something remarkable began to happen. The changes Jasmine championed weren't just seen on paper, they were felt within the halls of government offices. Employee satisfaction soared as workers felt more supported and heard. Department heads who had once resisted change now spoke openly about the positive impact of these new policies. Productivity improved, but more importantly, there was a noticeable shift in the overall culture. People felt respected, valued, and most importantly, empowered. Jasmine's partnership with Judge Ellison became a symbol of what could happen when people with power took a step back, acknowledged their biases, and chose to stand with reformers instead of against them. The road ahead wasn't without its challenges. There were still those who resisted change, who clung to old systems and practices. But Jasmine, once a quiet disruptor, was no longer fighting alone. With an ally in the courtroom and an army of supporters in the government, she was leading a revolution that was transforming the very foundation of public service. And as for Judge Ellison, he had learned a powerful lesson. Sometimes, true justice doesn't just come from the courtroom. It comes from listening, learning, and being willing to change.